It is a very great pleasure for me to get to be the one to introduce Ralph Cossa tonight. As Charles alluded to in his prayer, this is Ralph's second visit to BYU, and so he's a bit of a known quantity here, and it's a very nice quantity and quality, I might add. Ralph Cossa is president of the Pacific Forum CSIS in Honolulu, a nonprofit foreign policy research institute that's affiliated with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, in Washington, D.C., and a member of the CSIS Board of Trustees. He's a founding member and former international co-chair of the Multinational Track 2 Council for Security and Cooperation in the Asia-Pacific, CSCAP, which links member committees from 21 Asia-Pacific countries. He co-chairs the CSCAP study group aimed at halting the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction in the Asia-Pacific region, and also serves as executive director of the U.S. member committee. He's the primary U.S. representative to the ASEAN Regional Forum, Experts and Eminent Persons Group. He is senior editor of the Pacific Forum's electronic journal, Comparative Connections, and a member of the editorial boards of a number of international journals, including Korea Review and Security Challenges. He also sits on the board of the Pacific Asian Affairs Council, Honolulu, and is a member of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, the Council on U.S.-Korean Security Studies, and the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and is a frequent contributor to a number of well-known newspapers, and a wonderful speaker. I can tell you already that you're going to enjoy this a great deal. And I have to say on a personal note that Ralph Cossa is a lovely, fine, generous, kind man, and it's a delight always to have him with us. He will now present his talk as America Pivots, Trends and Opportunities in the Asia-Pacific Region. Welcome, Ralph.
Well, thank you, Emily. I was hoping a little less generous introduction because now you've raised expectations probably too high and I'll be in a lot of trouble. It's great to be back. It's always nice to be welcomed back. I started to let that go to my head for a minute, and then I realized America is the nation of second chances, and what they were trying to do is give me a second chance to get it right. So I thank my mentor, Dr. Amos Jordan, for all that he has done to sort of put this program together and to give me an opportunity to be a part of it. We have a number of the students. I've spent the last day sort of listening to them. I'm going to try to gear my remarks primarily to them because this is, I think, part of their important learning experience. I tried to sort of think back to when seems like about 150 years ago when I was in college and sort of remind myself. And I remember having a mentor, someone like Amos Jordan, who used to take us all aside and say, focus, focus, focus. A man becomes what he thinks about most. You have to be very serious at this stage in your life. And I thought about that for a minute, and I said, well, if it was really true that a man became what he thought about most, by the time I was 21, I would have been a woman. So I know that advice probably wasn't true then, but I know that this is a much more serious group, so I'm sure in this case the advice probably holds true. Unlike all of their previous speakers, I am not a West Point graduate. I have to acknowledge that at the first. In fact, my Army friends accuse me of having joined the Air Force in order to avoid military service, and we've sort of gone through that. But it's wonderful to see some young fellows in uniform and some instructors here from West Point as well. And I think we owe them all a real debt of gratitude. And I'm very proud to be able to participate in this program, which sort of puts a focus on national security and what we're trying to do. I've been asked to talk primarily about Asia, and I will do that. I wanted to really sort of break my talk into sort of two topics. One, the so-called America pivot toward Asia, and then secondly, looking very quickly at some of the trends and challenges that we face in Asia today. I think the term pivot came out of actually Secretary Clinton's speech in Honolulu, where I'm from, back in November during the APEC meeting. And she talked about America's sort of pivot away from Afghanistan and Iraq and toward Asia. And this became the Obama pivot strategy and was a big focus when he was in Australia speaking and talked about U.S. deploying some troops to Australia. President Obama actually never used the term pivot. The Pentagon hates it. They would rather say reassess or rebalance. But the press loves it because it's simple, and scholars like myself love it because we can then tell people they shouldn't use the word pivot. So we like it just because we can criticize it. The reality is the only thing new about the strategy is the term pivot. The reassessment, the refocus on Asia goes back to the Bush administration. The George H.W. Bush administration in 1989, with the end of the Cold War, there was a recognition that the 21st century would be the Asia century, and that America had to sort of focus its attention here because of the rising security challenges, but also the rising economic and political opportunities, the transformations that were underway in Asia. And this was at a time when China was not even considered a threat. China was still actually our friend in many cases. The Chinese were helping to balance us against the Soviet Union, you'll recall. So this wasn't about China. And now when we talk about the pivot, it's all about China. But really the focus on Asia was based not on concern about China, but concern for our own national security interests and the need to move in that direction. And this was followed as well by the Clinton administration, their new Pacific Community. But as you're aware, and as we've discussed in the last couple of days, we get sidetracked from time to time. As we try to swing toward Asia, we keep hitting the Middle East and getting stuck there. And certainly Iraq and Afghanistan have preoccupied a lot of our time and energy and treasure over the past 8 years or so. Now, I think the administration is trying to once again focus on Asia. The buzzword, which is a very unfortunate one, is America is back in Asia. I say it's unfortunate because the reality is we never left. We have always been in Asia. We've always had a very strong presence. The need to sort of stress the pivot, even though it's not new, and stress that America is back, is really due to concerns in Asia about American commitment and American staying power. This also is not new. I was stationed in Korea as a young lieutenant in the Air Force in 1969. When we arrived, we were told the most important reason that you're here is to reassure the South Koreans that we're here to defend them and America is here to stay. We're still saying that. You can never have enough reassurance. It's sort of reassure, reassure, reassure. But there are a lot of concerns today as Asians, as others watch the rise of China, but also as they see the perception of a decline of the United States. Not in our military power, we're still second to none. Not really even in our economic power. We still have an economy 4 times the size of China. But in our political image, they look and they see our politicians unable to sort of get their own act together and concerns about the government shutting down, and they listen to a lot of the silliness that we sort of take for granted or disregard when we hear politicians during campaigns. We all hope or know that they don't really believe all that they're saying, and they're not going to do this. But it's confusing people in Asia. It's confusing people sort of around the world. So we've had to sort of try to refocus and reassure that we are committed to remaining in Asia. We talked a little bit today at lunch, an excellent presentation by John Nagel on the sort of the elements of power, quoting a man who happens to be the chairman of the Pacific Forum's Board of Governors, Dr. Joseph Nye. And Nye talks about sort of this 3-dimensional chessboard of U.S. power, military power, economic power, and what he coined back in 1990, soft power. The value, the power, the attractiveness of your ideals and your values and your culture. There are some countries in Asia that want us there because of our military power. If you're a South Korean and you're faced with the North Korean with nuclear weapons, if you're a Japan and you're faced with a growing, rising China with increased assertiveness, you want to have the U.S. security umbrella, and that umbrella is there and it's being provided, and and it's solid. Everyone wants us, likes us, or at least tolerates us because of our economic power. And again, China right now is buying up a lot of natural resources, and there's a lot of increased economic interaction with China. But they're buying up those resources in order to build products to sell to Americans. And if the Americans stop buying, then the Chinese are going to have an awful lot of stuff on their hand with nothing to do with it, and their economy is going to slow down as well. So we're still sort of the engine, and people understand that. But it's the soft power that's the challenge. And whereas you can point to countries that are the challenge to our hard power or to our economic power, the only challenge to our soft power is us, is ourselves, by failing to live up to our ideals, by not promoting the right things, by saying one thing and pursuing another. People expect the United States to promote democracy. It's not what we're doing, it's how we do it. That's the problem. If we're trying to shove it down their throat, if we're trying to say the American model is the only model that works, or if we're trying to let it evolve as it's evolved in Taiwan, as it's evolved in South Korea and the Philippines, Indonesia and others. So it's a matter of, in some cases, bedside manner more than anything else. And people are watching. They're sometimes cautiously optimistic, sometimes cautiously pessimistic. And all of this is sort of in the shadow of a rising China, and what does it all mean? Now let me sort of talk about trends and challenges. I started making a quick list, and I got to about 30, and I said, well, let me see, if I try to cover 30 points tonight, not only will you fall asleep, I'll fall asleep, and that's always bad form when the speaker falls asleep while he's speaking. So I tried to sort of narrow it down to essentially 5 major trends that were the ones that I had talked about here previously. Again, I'm hoping there are some people in the room who were here during that first meeting. I hope that you've forgotten what I said. Not because I'm going to repeat it, but because I may say something contradictory. And the one thing that's wonderful about the United States is you get all of these talking heads and all of these experts who can go on day after day, and no one ever holds them accountable. So you can say things and, without fear of contradiction. My sarcastic word of advice is when you hear all of these experts, quote unquote, talking on TV, try to think back over the other things that they've told you, because most of them are wrong most of the time. And particularly in my area, in the area of dealing with China, and particularly in dealing with North Korea, the reality is we're all guessing. Some of us have guessed for a long time. Sometimes we're right, sometimes we're wrong, but we're all guessing. And we're sort of trained to speak with a great deal of authority on things we're just guessing about. So sort of keep that in mind. And I will remind you again at the end, particularly when we talk about North Korea, that it's my best guess, but we're all guessing on this. And anyone who sort of tells you otherwise is either trying to fool you or trying to fool themselves, or sometimes both. So having sort of given you the warning that this is just my best guess that you're going to hear now, let me talk about the 5 quick trends. One is the growing importance of Southeast Asia and ASEAN. The second is sort of building from that, looking at regional cooperation, something the U.S. has been very strong on. The third, and a very important trend, particularly with this administration, has been the efforts to move toward a nuclear weapons-free world. The fourth, and one of the big issues that I've already mentioned, I think 6 times, is China, the rise of China and how we deal with that. And then last, the broader cooperation in Northeast Asia and the interaction with our allies, the one area that has been consistent in American foreign policy over the last 60 years. But let me do these real briefly, because what I want to do is really open up the floor for Q&A and discussion, and that's where I think things will be most useful. When I spoke here a couple of years ago on ASEAN, I said the greatest challenge in dealing with Southeast Asia, an area that is incredibly important to us. We invest 3 times as much money, direct foreign investment from the United States, in Southeast Asia than we do in China. 10 times as much as we do in India. This area, which encompasses Indonesia, Vietnam, and all the other Southeast Asian nations, is a very important area to us economically as well as politically. The big challenge a couple of years ago is an opportunity today, and that's Burma. which we will soon be calling Myanmar. We're one of the few countries that still calls it Burma rather than Myanmar, but I think that's going to change. There's actually some remarkable transformation going on. Are they going to become a Jeffersonian democracy? Probably not in my lifetime, or maybe not even in yours. But the leaders there have caught on that their own policies are self-destructive. They've watched the Arab Spring. They've watched Eastern Europe. They've watched other things. They've also watched the growing influence of China because they've been their only friend, and therefore have become very codependent on the Chinese to the point of being very nervous. And they've made the decision to try to move forward. There's also been remarkable changes on the ground. 10 years ago, I had the great pleasure of meeting Aung San Suu Kyi and giving a lecture at her National League for Democracy headquarters. At that time, her view was no compromise. You can't trust the government here, no compromise. I won the last election fair and square, and until they're ready to turn over power to me, we won't compromise. Today, you see her running for office. She will win. She will then probably be named the minister in the government. That's when we'll start calling it Myanmar, because she'll start calling it Myanmar. This is a remarkable, yet still very limited and tentative first step. But it does, I'd say, show some great progress and is one of the success stories in our attempt to focus on Southeast Asia and reach common accord with the countries there. We then step back one step and look at the broader Asia-Pacific cooperation. ASEAN is just Southeast Asia, just those 10 countries, but we're part of a broader framework of cooperation within the Asia-Pacific community, and there are a number of organizations. There's the ASEAN Regional Forum that I'm affiliated with, which brings together a lot of the countries in the region. There's also APEC, which is an economic gathering which has many of the countries in Asia, not all of them, but also has some of the Pacific Rim countries in Latin America, sort of a very strange combination in some respects. And then you have the new East Asia Summit, which is bringing together all of the countries of Asia, along with Australia, New Zealand, India, and the United States and Russia. This will be the real important multilateral setting of the future. And we will be working in that direction. And again, President Obama attended his first meeting of the EAS this past year, and that's something, again, with some sort of hope. One of the things that these organizations have been trying to focus on now is to counter proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, something that's been very important and very high on the US agenda. 4 years ago, during the presidential elections, the only issue that the two candidates agreed on was that the greatest threat to the United States came from weapons of mass destruction falling into the hands of non-state actors. I will tell you that that will probably be the only issue that in the next election, once the Republicans have decided who is going to be running against President Obama, the only thing that they will continue to agree on is that that is a primary threat. And we are now starting to work with these countries multilaterally. The reason why they're more cooperative and willing to work with us is because, from almost everyone else's opinion in the world, non-proliferation and disarmament are two sides of the same coin. And until President Obama gave his Prague speech a couple of years back, where he committed the US and worked with the Russians to move toward zero, move toward a nuclear weapon-free world, we had a great deal of difficulty in getting people to cooperate with us in the area of non-proliferation. Now, I will tell you that I don't believe we're going to get to zero. I don't know how we can get to zero. The challenges involved in that are daunting. We gave a lecture in Japan a couple of months ago on this whole category, and one of the Japanese in the audience raised his hand and said, when you're down to only one nuclear weapon in the world, who has it? And that is obviously the key question. And I asked him, I said, well, who do you think should have it? And he said, the Japanese, because we're the only ones that have had it used against us. I haven't found any Chinese who are willing to give their last nuclear weapon to the Japanese to hold for safekeeping. So getting to zero is going to be a problem. But what we've done and why we've made some progress is that we haven't let the difficulties of getting to zero stop us from moving toward zero. And this has really been the mindset that has changed in the last couple of years. And it's important for Asia for a couple of reasons. One is because the US and Russia have been cooperating significantly in bringing our numbers down, but have made it very clear at some point we're not going to get down low enough to encourage the Chinese and the Indians and others to come up to join us. So at some point in this dialogue of reducing nuclear weapons, you've got to bring the Chinese on board. The Chinese are the key actor. The Chinese have agreed that they have to be part of this dialogue, quote, at the appropriate time, unquote. But you will never get any Chinese who will tell you when that appropriate time is, but they're all convinced it's not now. But the US and Russia and others have been trying to focus on that. The other big challenge, and here's where we get into the guessing game, the other big challenge is you can't get to zero by adding. And right now we're very concerned as a country about Iran. I'm very grateful every morning when I wake up that I am not working on the Middle East. I used to work on the Middle East years ago. I was very pleased to go back to working on Asia, where the solutions may be a little more difficult to find, but people will actually follow them. In the Middle East, the solutions are obvious, but no one will ever follow them, so you just sort of continue beating your head against the wall. But we, of course, have the problem with North Korea. North Korea without nuclear weapons is the Congo without jewels. It's Albania. It's a completely failed state. So the North Koreans are not in a big rush to give up these nuclear weapons. So it's their only bargaining chip. Without them, they're going to be ignored. They understand they're going to be ignored. So we're in for a really hard battle. We've talked a little bit, and people have asked a lot about, is there a change coming on right now with Kim Il-sung, the leader for the last 20 years or so, has died. His son, a 28-year-old or 29-year-old, we're not even sure how old he is, has taken over. We've suddenly had this, quote, breakthrough where we're starting to talk with one another. Does this mean that the son is sort of enlightened and is going to move things in the opposite direction? We're all guessing, folks, but my guess is no. And the reason why is because what the new regime is doing in North Korea is essentially following the steps that were put in place by the father. The day the father died was 2 days before the US and North Korea were supposed to sit down and reach the agreement that we reached 2 weeks ago. But everything got delayed because of the death. If they were going to change policy, it would have taken them 6 months to a year to consolidate it. They essentially, Kim Il-sung laid out a game plan, and they're following that right now. What is that game plan? I'm not sure. But I can pretty well guarantee you the end of that game plan is not, we're going to give up our nuclear weapons. So we've got a pretty hard challenge in front of us dealing with it. Our quid pro quo is to try to open up the North Korean society, to sort of create an Arab Spring ultimately in North Korea, to sort of see what happened in Eastern Europe years ago as people became more aware. People are starving in North Korea. Starving people don't overthrow governments. Starving people starve. They die. People that overthrow governments are sort of the rising middle class, the ones that see that things could be and should be better. And those are the people we're just now starting to try to reach out to in North Korea. So it's going to be a long, difficult process before we get there. The real key is that we stay in lockstep between the US and South Korea. We've been able to do that for the last 4 years. But there are elections coming up, not just in the United States, but in South Korea this fall. The elections in South Korea could have a greater impact on US foreign policy in Northeast Asia than the elections in the United States. And I say that because we've had a very bipartisan policy vis-a-vis Asia. For the last 50 years, our alliances have been the key, and we've supported that. We've had an engagement policy since Nixon with the Chinese. These are all things that we continue. But South Korea, the political spectrum goes from way over here to way over here. Right now we're over here, but come December we may be over here again, and then that gets us out of sync, and we have to deal with that. So that's going to be the real challenge, and that's one of the downsides, one of the challenges of democracy, if you will, is that you can't sort of predict who's going to be in charge, and you have to sort of adjust policies beyond that. The real problem dealing with North Korea is that the Chinese have had them on life support for a number of years and don't want to pull the plug because the Chinese are very comfortable seeing a buffer state in North Korea that can sort of provide that buffer. I would tell you with a great deal of certainty that the day a government in South Korea says we are going to renounce our alliance with the United States, the Chinese would probably in a heartbeat pull the plug on the North Korea and say goodbye, and the winner is South Korea, and that's who you really want. But the South Koreans aren't about to do that. The South Koreans have 2,000 or 3,000 years of history with China. They understand that these are neighbors, that it's best to have a big friend in your corner when you're dealing with them, and that's sort of part of the dynamic. U.S.-China relations have been very difficult, very sensitive, but generally a bipartisan view in the United States. John gave some terrific comments on China today. I would tell you I strongly agree with half of what he said, and I'll tell you the part that I disagree with, and then maybe tomorrow we can debate it over lunch or something. The Obama administration came to power with a unique opportunity to take U.S.-China relations to the next level. During the Clinton administration, Clinton had ran against H.W. Bush, saying he was coddling the butchers of Beijing. And we started out in a hole and then had to sort of dig out. George W. Bush ran against China as the strategic competitors. Started in a hole and had to dig out, and then we had the EP3 incident, which you may recall. One of our planes collided with a Chinese MiG, and it sort of put us in the hole to start with. China was not an issue 4 years ago in the election, and as a result, Obama was able to come into power, not in a hole, but with an opportunity to sort of raise things to the next level, and he made some efforts to do that. Unfortunately, the Chinese were feeling pretty good about themselves, and in my view, again, we're all guessing, but in my view, the Chinese interpreted U.S. hospitality and cooperation and friendship as weakness. I used to tell my Chinese friends, beware of premature arrogance. They didn't listen. 2010 was clearly the year of living arrogantly for the Chinese. They pushed in the South China Sea, they pushed in the East China Sea, they pushed with the North Koreans and protected the North Koreans as they were pushing. And guess what happened? We pushed back. The image of 2010 is President Obama sort of bowing toward the Emperor of Japan, toward the President of China. The image of 2011 was the George Washington aircraft carrier in the Yellow Sea, in the East China Sea, in the South China Sea, reminding the Chinese, reminding the North Koreans and others that we're not a has-been yet. We're still around. China, congratulations, you're now a 600-pound gorilla. We're still a 1,600-pound gorilla. And oh, by the way, we're housebroken. So the people would much rather have us in their backyard or in their front yard or living room than the Chinese. So now we've had sort of a readjustment. China has had remarkable success. That success, quite frankly, wouldn't have been possible. The Chinese don't like to acknowledge this, but would not have been possible if we had not been following a policy since the Nixon administration of integrating China, of helping China to build. We had a containment policy toward the Soviet Union. We know how to contain. We didn't invest billions, tens of billions of dollars in the Soviet Union. We let them sort of collapse of their own weight. We've invested tens of billions. The Japanese have invested tens of billions of China. The Chinese miracle is based in part on very hard work and very skillful management by the Chinese, but it's also built on American and Japanese and Western direct foreign investment. And it's created an interdependence which sort of gives us both mutually assured economic destruction. That's the same tact we took toward Germany and toward Japan after World War II, and it worked, by the way. They're both very close friends and allies. Some of us can remember when that wasn't the case. And ultimately, I believe that will work with China as well. If you ask most audiences which country has the largest economy today, the United States, Japan, or China, at least a third to a half, sometimes more, will say China. Well, the reality is China this past year surpassed Japan. It is now the second largest economy in the world, 1/4 the size of the economy of the United States. Some are predicting that in gross domestic product, China will surpass the United States in the next 5 years. I'm not an economist, but I don't understand that math. No matter how fast China goes, unless we start going backwards at 10% a year, it's 20, 30 years from now before China is able to sort of reach where we are. And when they do, per capita income is still going to be a tenth of what ours is. And oh, by the way, Japan is still the third richest nation on earth. And when you look at per capita income, if you need a loan, who are you going to go to, the Chinese or the Japanese? Well, the Chinese don't have any money to spare, but Japan is still, despite some of the tragedies they've been through in the last year, are still one of the most richest and powerful countries in the world. When you talk about soft power, as we talked about a little bit earlier, Japan has a reservoir of soft power, both in terms of being the only country that is dedicated to peaceful solution to problems, that has forsworn the use of military force to solve problems, certainly dedicated to moving toward a nuclear-free world, et cetera, et cetera. So we shouldn't overestimate the Chinese or underestimate Japan. When I talk about China, I use the Wizard of Oz analogy. If you guys all remember the Wizard of Oz, and everyone's sort of cowering behind this great big shadow on the screen, and then the little dog sort of looks behind the screen and sees this little guy casting this great big shadow. That's China today. That guy's grown. He's taller than he used to be, but he's still only about 5'4". He's casting this big shadow. People are reacting to it. China this year put out an aircraft carrier out to sea to test it. This was a 1984 Soviet/Ukrainian platform that they have, that was going to be a floating casino in Hong Kong, and now the Chinese are trying to use it as an aircraft carrier. Immediately, people are equating the Chinese Navy with the 7th Fleet. Preposterous, absolutely preposterous. The strongest Navy in the Pacific outside of the American Navy, the strongest Navy by far is still the Japanese Navy. And if you're choosing up sides for a war game, you're going to choose the Japanese first, you're going to choose the Koreans second, and there are a couple others you might consider before you want to bring the Chinese in on your team. It's not to say China doesn't represent a challenge. The biggest threat to China is China. It's dealing with their own youth. It's dealing with a group of 20 and 30-somethings, and we see them all. I've got 2 of them that are studying at Pacific Forum today. I've had a half a dozen who have been at Pacific Forum previously. 5 out of those 6, by the way, are still in the United States somewhere. This is the best and the brightest, and they're in no rush to go back to China because they see their greater opportunities here and don't sort of like what they're seeing at home. That's the real challenge to China, is internally and managing this among a generation that has never seen anything but the pie getting bigger every year. So that I would much rather, as many problems as we have, I would much rather have our problems than China's problems. And I don't lose a lot of sleep, quite frankly, about China surpassing the United States anytime in my lifetime. Certainly not economically, certainly not politically, and certainly not in soft power. There may be countries in Asia that say, boy, I wish that my government was as rich as the Chinese government, but no one wakes up in the morning and says, boy, I wish my government would treat me the way the Chinese treat their people. And that's American soft power, and that's Japanese and South Korean soft power, and that's the real advantage, and that's what the 20-somethings and the 30-somethings in China are looking at, and that's why I don't worry at the end of the day about Chinese power, or either soft or hard power, because the Chinese are going to have their hands full just dealing with what they have now. I was mentioning a couple of folks at dinner. I've had discussions with the Chinese about the Arab Spring. And the Chinese say it could never happen in China for three reasons. Number one, in the Middle East, globalization is the enemy. In China, it's our friend. We embrace globalization. We see the value of it. Very true. Number two, in the Middle East, young people look ahead and things look hopeless. Unemployment high, et cetera, et cetera. In China, young people look ahead and the future is bright. The pie is getting bigger every year, the greater opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. And they're right. And then they say, number three, we understand the power of the internet, and we're taking steps to make sure that it can't be used to undermine the solidity of the government and the party. So you say, you know what? If number one and two were really true, you wouldn't need to do number three. So there's still a problem there. And I was in China a couple of years ago, and I was complaining that my website was being blocked in China because somebody had written something on Tibet, and that upset the Chinese, so they, sort of block your website. And I complained to a group of party officials about the website being blocked, and this one young party official came up to me later and he said, there's no problem. We use Yahoo Navigator. We get around the blocks. There's no problem. I couldn't figure out how to access my website. Every young person in China knows how to do it, and they know how to get something on the Dalai Lama and get something on what's really happening in the world. Even if and they look at their government and they say, God, you must think I'm stupid if you don't think I can figure out how to get around this. So that's, to me, is sort of the real challenge. The final point I'll make, and I've droned on too long already, I apologize, but the final point I'll make is sort of on Northeast Asia cooperation. We've been trying to do this sort of ad hoc thing called the Six-Party Talks. And it's been aimed primarily at trying to denuclearize North Korea, which in my view is not going to happen anytime soon. What we really need to focus on is sort of containing them, opening them up, and hopefully that we'll see the sort of the Helsinki process finally work in North Korea over a number of years. But all of this is based on the solid foundation of U.S. alliances with Japan, with South Korea, with Australia, also with the Philippines and Thailand. This has been one of our real strengths in Asia, and this will continue to be one of our real strengths. And every Asia speech by every president during my lifetime has started off by talking about the importance of our Asia alliances and our relationships and on continuing to build those and grow those. And as long as we continue to do that, I think we're going to be in good shape as far as our relationships with Asia go, and I think we're going to see Asia moving in the right direction, something that will serve their purpose as well and will serve our purpose as well in addition. So, Richard, let me stop there if I can. I've gone on a little too long, but what I really value is your questions and comments, and please fire away.
We have a microphone right back here on this side. It will pick up the sound for the recording, and so we'd invite you, and let's begin with, especially with students who'd like to ask questions, to please use the microphone.
Okay, we have the first brave volunteer. Yeah.
I was just wondering if you could share some comments on the U.S.'s relationship with Thailand and what we have invested with that country.
Good. Again, and I was remiss in not mentioning when I talked about key countries in Southeast Asia, Thailand has been a longstanding ally of the United States. It's also been a country that we've had a very much of an up and down relationship with. It gives me an opportunity also to make another point, which you probably weren't trying to drive at, but we have, one of the wisdoms of our founding fathers was to try to put foreign policy in the hand of the president and not in the legislature. Ever since then, we've had Congresses who have tried to find a way to run foreign policy. One of the ways we've done that is by essentially establishing rules that say any country that has, where a, quote, democratic government is overthrown by a military coup, we have to break off all relations with. Thailand had that situation where they had a, quote, democratic government, that was becoming more and more corrupt. You had a military that essentially forced the issue and then returned to now another form of democracy, but we sort of shot ourselves in the foot and stopped dealing with them. We had a similar situation in Indonesia, where an element of the Indonesian armed forces did some fairly nasty things in Timor, and certainly we shouldn't have tolerated that and we should have criticized it, but the congressional response was to cut off all mill-to-mill training with the Indonesians. So whereas before we used to get all of these bright, the best and the brightest young captains and majors from the Indonesian military to go to Carlisle Barracks or to even attend West Point or to go to our various service schools and get a bit of an indoctrination on what democracy is all about and America is all about, we went through an entire generation of military leaders in Indonesia that had no familiarity with the United States and no interaction with us because of this sort of legislation, shooting ourselves in the foot. We've sort of done that in some respects in Thailand. We're now seeing Thailand sort of back on board. Democracy has essentially been restored. There's still some challenges. There's two big challenges in Thailand. One is the politician who was, I think by all accounts, pretty corrupt and expelled. His sister is now the prime minister, and he wants to come back. And I think what's happened is that he was assuming his sister would become his proxy. And once she took over, she kind of likes being prime minister of Thailand and is not necessarily going to listen to everything her brother says, but he's sort of eager to come back. That's going to create some tensions. The other real tension is that Thailand is a very unique nation in that the monarchy still exists and there's great reverence for the king. The king is getting on in years. There's not that kind of reverence for his son. There is a great deal of reverence for the daughter, but the way things are going, it's more likely the son is going to take over, although it's not guaranteed. And I think the daughter probably has a food taster now to make sure her brother doesn't slip her something that she doesn't want to eat. So we're going to have those kind of challenges, I think, as well. Thailand has also suffered from an insurgency in the south, a Muslim insurgency that they've not been very effective in dealing with, so that there are a lot of challenges there. But Thailand is one of the few countries that has sort of maintained its independence and its autonomy over the years. It's never, it didn't get conquered by the Japanese. The Chinese never took it over. So they're very unique, and they're an important ally and partner of the United States. We saw this in 2004 when the tsunami hit in Indonesia and in Thailand. We had very little ability to interact in Indonesia. But because of the alliance structure with Thailand, we were able to essentially bring in massive amounts of assistance, create a headquarters at Utapao in Thailand, and sort of operate from there. If I could go off on a tangent, if you don't mind, one other thing that I was going to mention in my remarks and forgot is this whole idea about development assistance and emergency assistance. And it's something that you all have been talking about here in the last day and a half. But we've seen something very interesting in the last couple of years. What's the difference between Japan and the United States on one hand and Bangladesh and the Philippines on the other? Well, the difference is that Bangladesh and the Philippines have natural disasters that they can't handle frequently. As a result, they're very good at accepting foreign aid. They know how to do it. The rules are in place. The procedures are in place. And when a crisis hits in Bangladesh or in the Philippines or in many of these other countries, they dial 911 and the Americans and the American military comes to the rescue. When we had Katrina, and when the Japanese had the great tragedy of last March 11th, the triple whammy of one of the largest earthquakes in history, and then a 50-foot tidal wave, and then the nuclear meltdown, people wanted to go to help Japan because the United States are so used to being self-sufficient, of handling these things by ourselves. Japanese didn't have a clue. We didn't have a clue how to get people to help us. Taiwan wanted to send rescue teams with dogs to Japan. But the quarantine rules, how do we get around that? Well, you know, if you had been thinking about these type of things, you would have had a procedure in place. We had the same problem. There were countries in Europe and others that wanted to help us, and we didn't know how to bring them in, and we didn't have status of forces agreements to help with this and that. So sometimes you can be too powerful, you can be too advanced, and as a result, you're not prepared to let people help you, and you don't have those procedures in place. And this was a lesson that we kind of learned but haven't fully learned with Katrina, and that the Japanese learned in their case there. So this whole idea of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, which is one of the glues that is binding a lot of multilateral cooperation in Asia today. You can't cooperate in a lot of other different areas, but that's a non-sensitive area. Everybody wants to save people's lives. So it's an area where we can cooperate, but we have to really understand that you have to have the procedures in place so that both rich and poor know how to operate in that area. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about what I had forgotten to talk about, completely off the subject of your question. But I hope I got to your question. All right, good. Question, please.
You mentioned in your most recent article about the food for freeze with North Korea, about former six-party talks that were halted in the last session when you said something to the effect of the North Koreans pulled the rug out at the last minute. What's the possibility that they'll do that again in this round of talks?
Good, thank you. This is something very dangerous. He actually studied ahead and read something that I had written to hold me accountable to. That's unfair practice. Now, we just had this, as I mentioned very briefly, this, what I called a food for freeze agreement, which incidentally the U.S. hates to call it that because we insist that we gave food aid based on humanitarian needs, and the North Koreans gave the freeze because they understand that they need to do this in order to cooperate with us. And the North Koreans are insisting it was a quid pro quo deal, and we're insisting that it wasn't. As a result, there were two bilateral, unilateral announcements made and not a joint announcement. This is what you have to do in dealing with the North Koreans. But I pointed out in my article, and incidentally, anyone who's interested in being on our mailing list, if you'll give me your email address, I'm happy to add you, and then we're happy to flood your mailbox with our commentaries on what's right and wrong in the world. But we had, under the Bush administration, sort of come to a certain point in what I call a repeatable cycle with the North Koreans. The North Koreans sort of create a crisis, they create a bad atmosphere, and then they say, we'll let you pay us to behave. We'll let you pay us to do what we should have been doing like any other normal nation. And ultimately, we start off by saying we're not going to reward bad behavior, and then we reward bad behavior and sort of pay them to try to behave. We got in that cycle where the North Koreans, we gave them essentially 1 million tons of heavy fuel oil in return for them sort of freezing, quote, irreversibly and with complete transparency their nuclear program, except when it got to the point of trying to make it completely transparent by having a verification regime, the North Koreans said, no, we're not going to go there, pull the rug out, back to zero, back to missile tests and nuclear tests. Now we're back in that cycle for about the fourth time of, we're now willing to behave if you'll pay us. And they're not necessarily willing to give up their nuclear weapons. They're just essentially willing to not make things worse. Now, there's some value in things not getting worse. So, don't get me wrong. I'm not against talking with the North Koreans. I'm not against making shameless deals where we give them food for their starving people, and in return, they stop making things worse. But we need to not delude ourselves into thinking that this means that the North Koreans next Tuesday are going to give up their nuclear weapons. The North Koreans are going to move to a process until such time as it's put up or shut up time, and then they will first shut up and then start shouting, and then we'll sort of go through this routine again. And it's because the people in the Obama administration are the same ones who learned that lesson during the Clinton administration and then watched the Bush administration learn the lesson 2 more times during their 8 years, that they've been less eager to sort of rejoin that cycle. North Korea for the United States, for China, is a part-time job. President Obama wakes up in the morning, that's the last thing on his mind is dealing with North Korea. When Kim Jong-un wakes up in the morning, the first thing on his mind is how do I survive? And how do I play the US against China and against Russia, and how do I get the food and everything else? So, we're dealing with them on a part-time basis while their full-time job is figuring out how they can play us. And they're very good at it. And then we say they're irrational, they're crazy. Anytime you hear someone, particularly in the intelligence community, say the other guy is irrational, what he's really saying is, I can't figure out their rationale. But if you really look at how well the North Koreans have done in playing everyone against one another and getting what they've wanted, they have been the most rational actor in this game. And we need to sort of understand. The North Korean philosophy has been, stop or I'll shoot. And everyone sort of stands there and goes, oh my God, what should we do? Don't pull the trigger. And they've managed to turn their weakness into a strength. The fact that we care more about starving North Koreans than they do gives them leverage over us in dealing with humanitarian issues. It's perverse, it's backwards, it's not the way it's supposed to be, but it's the way it is, and that's sort of what we have to deal with. Yes, please.
How long are we going to maintain our troops in South Korea? My impression is we have about 40,000 there. We've done it for 55 or 60 years. It's bad for our deficit, it's bad for our balance of payments, and it causes them to be more efficient because we're carrying the cost of looking after them. It seems to me that there ought to be an end to this, and it ought to be sooner rather than later.
Well, that's one opinion. I would tell you I have an opposite opinion. First, right now we're down to about 25,000 troops on the ground in South Korea. We've reduced over the years, and they've taken on a broader mission than just security on the Korean Peninsula. There may come a day when it is fine for us to bring those forces home. In my view, today is not that day, particularly since it would send a signal to the North Koreans that our commitment is waning. It would send a commitment to the Japanese and to others that our commitment is waning. It would send a message to the Chinese that the United States is sort of turning its back and reducing its security commitment in Asia. So I think we're sort of locked in, at least in the near term, to that. Now, the good news is that the South Koreans are more and more paying for the cost of those forces. They don't pay as much as the Japanese do. What the Japanese are now finding is that the only thing more expensive than having American bases in Japan is getting us out. We're preparing to move some of our Marines from Okinawa to Guam, but we've given the Japanese such a horrendous bill to help build up Guam for us to move there that they're finding out it's more expensive to get us to go than to stay. But the point is that both Japan and Korea, unlike, as I understand it, Europe, have shouldered part of the burden of having U.S. forces on the ground through what's called host nation support. And that's, I think, a very important element. But to me, the real important thing is the symbol of U.S. commitment that those forces portray. Does it have to be 25,000? I don't think so. And we have reduced the numbers. It used to be like 35 or 37,000, so we've sort of cut it by a third. But the concern right now is sending North Korea the wrong message, and that is something that obviously we're very sensitive to. The real answer is, as long as the South Korean people and the American people are prepared to have us stay there. And it's been very interesting that the progressives are campaigning against the conservative government in Seoul right now on sort of a quasi-anti-American platform, and they're going to undo the free trade agreement between the U.S. and South Korea, except now they're saying, well, maybe we won't undo it, we'll just renegotiate it. And they said, and we also have to talk about the presence of U.S. forces. Maybe they shouldn't stay after reunification. So even the people who say Yankees go home, but not just yet. And the previous government, which sort of ran on an anti-American platform, the first thing the president did when he got reelected was to start working on strengthening the alliance because they understand the importance of it. So it's a very I think it's a very delicate balance. We have reduced numbers. We also need to reduce footprint, consolidate those forces. We're trying to do that both in Japan and in Korea, and I think that that's very important. But we have to give a symbol of continuing commitment, and at least some forces on the ground in both of those countries are a very important way that we do that. Now, we're also talking about deploying some forces in other areas. You may have seen, I mentioned just very briefly, the Marines to Darwin, Australia. Again, I mentioned this is part of our focus on Asia that's been going on for the last 30 years. When President Obama announced that we were going to send next year 250 U.S. Marines to train on a temporary basis in Darwin, Australia, the Chinese immediately protested and said this is part of the American containment policy and that Australia needs to be careful about being caught in the crossfire. Now, Darwin, Australia is 2,500 miles from the closest piece of Chinese territory. This would be like trying to contain Washington by sending troops to Provo. So it's a pretty big crossfire, but it's part of the Chinese will complain about anything that we're doing, but it also means they're getting our attention, or we're getting their attention, and we're demonstrating to them that we are here in Asia. We're going to do it in a smart way, rotations in and out that don't sort of disrupt and destroy relations on the ground. But it's all part of sort of demonstrating that the U.S. remains committed and that we understand that some type of a presence in Asia reinforces that commitment and provides people with the necessary confidence to then maintain their friendships and their alliances with us and able to deal with China from a position of strength rather than weakness. Okay, we got a line up there, so I'll try to give shorter answers. Go ahead.
Yes, I know that some public opinion polls indicate that there's an increasing sense of national identity among the Taiwanese. I just have a question: if you foresee a flare-up in Taiwan, the question of their status, and what effect that might have on U.S.-Chinese relations.
Thank you. One of the real success stories of the past 20 years has been the advent and the growth of democracy in Taiwan. And it's also a great counter and a reminder to the Chinese when they say, well, Western-style democracy doesn't work in Chinese culture. And we say, well, take a look at what's happening in Taiwan. They actually are making this work, and they've been very successful at it. And they've become one of the strongest economies in the world, despite all the disadvantages. There are maybe 3 to 5% of the people in Taiwan that still yearn for reunification with the mainland. And there are maybe 20%, 30% in Taiwan that would like to tell the Chinese tomorrow, get out of our life, leave us alone, we're an independent country, like it or lump it. The problem is that they might have to lump it, and no one's particularly eager. So the general mood in Taiwan is, let's pretend there's only one China, and in the meantime, you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone, and we'll continue on with our democratic ways and live happily ever after. And that's essentially what's happening. At some point, my prediction, and I've been predicting this for 20 years and it hasn't happened yet, so I'll just keep predicting it and maybe one day it will. One day you will have a one nation, two states, one country, two governments with some type of a shared sovereignty. So they'll all pretend there's still only one China, but within that one China there's a Republic of Taiwan and there's a People's Republic of China, and the Hu Jintao will be the queen or something like that, and we'll sort of live happily ever after. There'll be sort of a fig leaf of one China. The idea that Taiwan would want to become a province in mainland China today is nonsense. And in fact, even the hardcore Chinese understand that there's no reason for Taiwan to want to integrate with China. China has to sort of get itself up to Taiwan's level. So you just got to get another generation or two to pass in order to sort of accept the reality of two separate countries both claiming to be one China. And there'll be a one nation, two state solution, I think, ultimately, but it's going to still take some time. All right, please.
Sir, with cybersecurity becoming an issue or becoming relevant in recent years, what can we do to counter Chinese cyber threats and attacks?
Good. If you couldn't hear, the question was on cybersecurity and what can we do to deal with the Chinese cyber threat. This is, I think, one of the greatest challenges that we're going to face in the 21st century. But I will tell you, we run my organization on behalf of the Defense Department runs a strategic dialogue with the Chinese, where we bring American military and Chinese military together to talk about nuclear issues and security issues and space and cyber. And the Chinese this past year asked to put cyber on the agenda. And we said, okay, what do you want to talk about? What the Chinese wanted to do was try to convince us that that China is the victim of cyber attacks. It's not the perpetuator of cyber attacks. One went so far as to tell us that it was these Taiwanese tourists who come to China with their laptops and they get online, in the hotel somewhere and then start doing these attacks, and woe is us, We happen to have, as the head of our delegation on this past meeting, Admiral Denny Blair, who used to be the Director of Central Intelligence for the United States. And Admiral Blair listened to this for a while, and then finally he said, look, I used to be DCI. I know you spy on us. You know we spy on you. The difference is we try to follow certain rules, and it's done military versus military, and we understand that there are things that you can do and things that you can't do. You're doing industrial espionage, you're doing it on behalf of business, you're doing it against civil groups. We've got to get some rules before things get triggered. We also had a very, very sobering, and some of this is probably, well, it's too late now. It's sensitive but not classified. We don't do anything that's classified at Pacific Forum. But conversations about outer space and attacks against satellites and things like that. The Chinese were absolutely shocked when they were told, essentially during the Cold War, if we had taken out Soviet eyes in the sky, or the Soviets had taken out our eyes in the sky, this could have prompted a nuclear exchange. That this would have been seen as starting a nuclear war. See, the Chinese have a no first use policy. They believe that they would never use nuclear weapons unless someone else used it, and we should have that same policy, and therefore we have a safe competition. And they are now starting to learn that there are things they could do, and cyber falls into that category. If there was a cyber attack against the command and control of US nuclear forces, this could be interpreted as the first sign of an imminent attack, in which case our response could very well be launch before you can. And you could start a nuclear war this way. Very sobering, but this is the kind of conversations that we have to have with the Chinese. We're just starting to have them. We're doing it at the track 2 level, the non-governmental level, which essentially means we've got government officials on both sides in the room in their private capacities who can talk candidly to one another with the fig leaf of the Pacific Forum or some other organization allowing this dialogue to take place, because at the governmental level they're not yet prepared to do that. But these conversations are starting to take place. It is a very serious problem. It's not just China. I'm not sympathetic to the Chinese argument about a bunch of Taiwanese tourists, but the reality is these attacks can come from everywhere. South Koreans today raised their communications alert because they're hosting this national security summit in Seoul here in another week. They'll have heads of state from 50 different countries, and they're very worried that the North Koreans will be launching some type of cyber attacks in order to embarrass the South Koreans and make them look weak in the eyes of the world. So it's not just China. There's, and some of our friends are probably doing this stuff too. So it's a big challenge, and I don't think we've gotten a grasp on it. The guy sitting next to you probably knows a lot more about this than I do. So whisper to John what's the real answer, and he can tell you later. All right, please.
Do you think that the spread of Chinese businesses over the world are a security threat or challenge for U.S.? If so, what can be done?
Well, Chinese businessmen are a challenge to U.S. businessmen, and Chinese businessmen are starting to learn some of the rules, and we're trying to sort of enforce some of the rules. I think competition is a good thing. I think we need to be able to deal with that. Chinese do take unfair advantage in some areas, and fortunately, by being smart enough to bring them into the WTO, we have a mechanism now for dealing with that. It's not a perfect mechanism, but there are opportunities in place. And when you can get the EU, Japan, and the United States pressuring China on a particular issue at the WTO, it's a lot more effective than if we're trying to do it bilaterally or anyone else is trying to do it bilaterally. So there are challenges. The Chinese are also out trying to buy up everything in the world that they can. I was telling the story again at dinner to some of the folks, so I apologize for repeating, but Chinese are doing a lot of aid now. It's sort of hypocritical in some ways. They're still insisting that the Japanese give them aid because they're an undeveloped country, and at the same time they're going out giving aid to others. But when you get Chinese aid, it comes with Chinese attached. So I was in Timor-Leste, East Timor, last January. And the question I got repeatedly from different audiences was, how do we get Chinese aid without all these Chinese? Because the Chinese are coming in and they're building buildings for us, and then they're staying. China is one of the few nations on earth that has like 122 or 125 men for every 100 women. So a lot of these Chinese guys are out there, and then they start settling in these little villages in Timor and in Indonesia and in Africa and other places where they're going, and start essentially taking over these local economies. And that's a much bigger concern, quite honestly, than competing one-on-one with Chinese businessmen in the world. But at the end of the day, it hurts the Chinese, because people then become much more suspicious of Chinese aid and assistance and Chinese motives. So it all eventually comes back around, and that's, I think, part of the challenge.
Okay, my question is more related to Latin America. And the fact that maybe China is trying to get into Latin America stronger than, in the same way that the Soviet Union tried during the Cold War. So how can this, if you see in your vision that this could happen, and how that can affect the American, especially foreign policy, getting the Chinese so close?
Yeah, I think obviously we got to watch what the Chinese are doing in Latin America, in Africa, and all over the world, just as the Chinese are watching what we're doing in Asia. We can't very well say, well, Chinese aren't allowed in Latin America and shouldn't be investing there or trying to establish good relations there, but at the same time we're in Burma, trying to have good relations there. I think, at the end of the day, the Latin American countries have to make a choice and have to take a look at who they're getting in bed with. One of the things that the Chinese have to carry around with them is if you make a list of the world's top 10 tyrants, the one thing that they all have in common is their best friend is China. And what does this say about countries that want to sort of become really closely involved with the Chinese? And what does it say about the people in those countries who are going to be extremely suspicious about the Chinese? So I don't lose a lot of sleep, quite honestly. I mean, I'm not naive. I think China does pose a challenge that we need to be aware of, and we need to have faith in our own system and have faith in our own sort of soft power and economic power, and not sort of overreact to the Chinese threat, but sort of respond to it sensibly, and to help educate other countries to respond to it sensitively. But just as the Soviets tried and failed, and we've seen in the South Pacific, we had what I called rent-a countries, and we have these in Latin America too, the rent-a countries, where the Chinese and Taiwanese for years went in there and tried to buy off who was going to recognize which China. And now the Chinese and Taiwanese have finally figured out that this is not very effective, and they've had a diplomatic truce for the last 4 years, and all these corrupt governments around the world are saying, come on guys, start fighting again, please, because we want the corruption back. But sooner or later, people figure out that this isn't going to work to their advantage. Sir.
Mongolia is another East Asian country that shares a sense of insecurity due to growing presence of China. It has a small population, has history of losing its territory to China. So as we consider these factors, do you see Mongolia becoming another South Korea or Japan that's willing to allow U.S. military bases and become part of the U.S. strategy to deter China?
Good. I mean, the question is whether I see Mongolia becoming another South Korea or Japan and allowing military bases. The answer is no. Would the Mongolians like that? They would love that. The Mongolians would love to have, the United States provide a greater security presence. How do we get there? You can't get to Mongolia without either overflying Russia or China. So it makes it a little bit difficult. What we have done is provide a lot of developmental assistance to the Mongolians. We've given them an option other than having to become reliant on China. We've certainly helped them since they essentially threw the Soviets out at the end of the Cold War. Mongolia was controlled by the Soviet Union, not by China. So from my standpoint as a political scientist, Mongolia has been a wonderful test case. I've been there 7 times. I was part of their effort to develop their National Security Council and to lecture their military on the roles of military and democracy and encourage them to move in the area of peacekeeping and all of that. Mongolia sort of has one eye looking at Central Asia and has one eye looking toward Northeast Asia. And they've assumed, I think quite correctly, that their interests lie more in being part of Northeast Asia, even though from a geography standpoint, they're really more part of Central Asia. But they understand Central Asia is essentially the Russians and the Chinese trying to tell everyone else what to do, and they don't want to be part of that. I think our policy toward Mongolia and helping to promote democracy and assistance and development, and the country that's actually been the biggest actor in helping to promote this in Mongolia has been South Korea. And this is an area where we welcome and encourage the South Korean lead because there's a lot more in common there. So but I wouldn't want to see us put military bases in Mongolia. It would probably cause more problems than it solved. And last question, this young lady.
I would like to know what possibilities you foresee regarding the internal dynamics of China becoming more democratic and open, and how that would affect U.S.-China relations.
Well, I mean, the question is, what are the possibilities of China becoming more democratic and open? If you have watched China over the last 20 years, you would be amazed by how, quote, democratic and open China has become. The Chinese have actually even started having free local elections where non-communist party candidates can run against party candidates and in many cases win. What the Chinese do once that guy wins is they immediately invite him to join the party because they want to, so they're trying to sort of create democracy within the Communist Party. Will that work? I don't know. But keep in mind, for 40 years we were touting Japan democracy, and it was all different factions of the LDP deciding who was going to become the leader, and people got to choose from that faction. So it's going to be a slow process. But the Chinese understand that, and more importantly, your generation in China is going to demand it. One of the most popular figures in China today is Ma Ying-jeou, who is the president of Taiwan. And they find him, dynamic and attractive and popular. And oh, by the way, how come we don't have leaders like that? You hear young Chinese saying that. You see that on the blogs and all the rest of that. So that's sort of the internal dynamic that's going to force China to sort of change. Now, they are going to try to keep the party in control as long as they possibly can. They're going to try that by internal reform. Every Democrat in the United States would like to be able to keep the Democrats in power forever, and every Republican would like to see the Republicans, but it doesn't work that way, fortunately. And ultimately, that's going to evolve in China as well. It will be democracy with Chinese characteristics, as the Chinese say. It's going to be slow in coming, but you're already seeing a great deal of liberalization. I mean, when I first started going to China, there was one newspaper, and that was all you were getting. I have, in the last year, appeared on CCTV in China about a dozen times via Skype. And they call me, and I sit at my laptop, and I do the thing and debate Chinese. And sometimes the moderator will be tougher on the Chinese guy that I'm talking to than on me. And it's marvelous to watch this. And you go to China, and you go to the think tanks, and you talk to people, and they start arguing amongst themselves. Whereas 10 years ago, it was just coincidence, I'm sure, that every Chinese scholar had the same exact opinion on the same exact topics. There is a transformation underway. The Chinese are trying to do it in a slow, controlled, measured way. The Arab Spring, I think, has frightened them. It has sobered them. But Tiananmen really frightened them and sobered them as well. One wonders if on June 3rd, the students had peacefully left Tiananmen Square, where China would be today, because that process was underway at that point, and then they sort of lost control of it, and the process got out of hand, and then they overreacted to it, and now they're sort of trying to bring it back. But when all of a sudden a couple of hundred Falun Gong practitioners show up in front of the Chinese guest houses and start practicing, and the Chinese go, "Oh my God, how did they manage to do this?" It sobers them. It keeps them very nervous. They want to move things very slowly, but life is happening to the Chinese. So from my standpoint, is it moving fast enough? Absolutely not. And has there been some backsliding in the last couple of years? Yes. I asked a young Chinese, one of our young Chinese fellows who was in residence at Pacific Forum, I said, when this backsliding started occurring a couple of years ago, I said, is this a sign of Chinese insecurity, or is this a sign of Chinese overconfidence? Do you feel so confident now that you can sort of shove people down and without the West, because you don't care about the West complaining? Or are you so insecure that you feel like you have to hold the people down? And she said the answer is yes. We feel very confident in dealing with the United States. Our leadership feels very insecure in dealing with my generation. That to me is a telling thing, and which gives me a lot of encouragement that there will be a gradual but effective and irreversible transformation underway in China, that the party will try to slow down, it will try to channel, but ultimately won't be able to control. Well, good. Thank you very much for your patience and this opportunity.